Seems determined to torment me.
I'm stubborn, you know, and I always get my way in the end.
Fanny, we're late. I'm so sorry.
It's of no importance.
Oh, I do apologize, but selfishness must always be forgiven, you know, because there's never any hope of a cure.
What I feel for Edmund is different.
You've said enough.
Mansfield Park, part of the complete Jane Austen on Masterpiece. Masterpiece is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
It must be wonderful to be a brilliant writer, to be imaginative, to say funny, clever things, to write your own good lines. Like Jane Austen, who was funny in letters, funny on the page, ironic, witty, and like her character Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park. Mary is a woman almost as talented as Jane Austen herself. She gets all the best lines, and she's a woman men notice and fall in love with. But from what we know, Jane Austen was herself a bit of a plain Jane. So Jane Austen is obviously making up for what's missing in her own life and putting it in her fiction. In Mary Crawford, she's creating a heroine based on herself, but a more attractive self. Except that Mary Crawford isn't the heroine of Mansfield Park. The story belongs to someone else. It's a character called Fanny Price, an outsider whose good qualities have nothing to do with being clever.
Hi, I'm Mark Wahlberg. Join us on our search for America's hidden treasures.
In my 10 years doing the show, I've never seen Whistler prints of this caliber.
Really?
Oh, my God.
Surprised?
Yes, I wasn't expecting that one.
Next time from Orlando, Florida, on Antiques Roadshow. Tomorrow at 8, 7 Central on most PBS stations.
Miss Austen, Jane, would you marry me?
If we could only see into the future.
Are you really never in love?
The only way to get a man like Mr. Darcy is to make him up. Depend upon it, Fanny, the right man will come along.
He never did for you.
I couldn't marry a man I didn't love.
The story behind the stories.
Tell me now you regret it.
Miss Austen Regrets, part of the complete Jane Austen. Next time on Masterpiece. Which Austen leading man would make an ideal suitor? Pick your favorite at Masterpiece online at pbs.org. To order Mansfield Park on DVD, the original novel, or a special edition book featuring the complete collected works of Jane Austen, please call 1-800-255-9424. Masterpiece is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
We are PBS.
Local broadcast of Masterpiece Theatre on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by Nicholas Hoare Booksellers, Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. Predominantly British bookshops featuring a broad selection of books and CDs for both adults and children in settings which invite browsing. Information on the web. By Kendall at Hanover, an accredited continuing care retirement community in New Hampshire's Upper Valley. providing experience, environment, and education for older persons near Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, offering small-town charm, cosmopolitan culture, and atmosphere. By Otter Creek, offering custom-crafted and professionally installed awnings, sunrooms, and closet systems to distinguishing homeowners throughout Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York for over 30 years. This program is also supported by contributing members like you. Broadcast of this evening's programs on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by Burlington's Flynn Center for the Performing Arts, presenting folk singer and songwriter Arlo Guthrie and his solo reunion tour, Saturday, February 2nd at 8 p.m. This program is also supported by contributing members like you.
You're watching viewer-supported Vermont Public Television, Vermont's statewide public television network.
Notice how digital's made everything better, especially television? Digital TV's got better picture, better sound, more channels. In fact, it's so much better that by law, all broadcast TV has to be digital by 2009. But some TVs will need an upgrade to get digital. You could even lose your signal. Get the facts. Visit our website at vpt.org for more information about going digital.
On Nova, the Parthenon, revered icon of Western civilization.
A powerful statement of what human beings are capable of.
How did the ancients build it?
Very simply, but ingeniously.
Nova uncovers clues trapped in stone.
Here lies the DNA of the Parthenon.
Secrets of the Parthenon. On Nova.
That's Tuesday night at 8 on VPT.
Next time on Frontline, in a lawless territory, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have regrouped from inside this secretive land.
These guys have shown they are not going to quit.
Frontline investigates the return of the Taliban.
Join us Tuesday at 10 here on VPT.
Once, Jews were excluded. In the 1950s, the barriers begin to fall.
We weren't playing on Jewishness. We weren't selling Jewishness. You play it for the fun of it.
Jewish Americans are breaking out, throwing their support behind causes they believe in.
They did not hesitate. Here am I. Let me go. Send me.
Civil rights, Israel, the plight of Soviet Jews. Even a Hasidic Jew is reaching out to Americans everywhere. Next, the Jewish Americans, home.
Major funding for this program is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, because democracy demands wisdom. The Nash Family Foundation. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education. The Paul and Irma Milstein Foundation. The Skirball Foundation. The Chase Family Foundation. And the Harry and Belle Krupnick Endowment Fund of the Jewish Community Foundation. Additional funding is provided by the following. A complete list is available from PBS. This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Few people believed that Bess Meyerson could ever win the country's most famous beauty contest. A Jew had never been Miss America, and Bess looked decidedly Jewish. As she made it through one round after another, Jewish Americans all across the country held their breath. Pageant officials had suggested Bess change her name. Beth Meredith, if was allowed, might improve her chances of winning. Bess refused. It was, she said, the most important decision of my life.
They're about to pick Miss America of 1945.
Well, they've made their choice, and the crown goes to Miss New York City, a 21-year-old, 5'10" brunette, Bess Meyerson, Hunter College graduate.
It was the fall of 1945, just 4 months after Hitler had surrendered. Jewish Americans had been horrified by the news that millions of Jews had been murdered in Europe. In Bess Meyerson, they found a moment of hope, a living testament to the promise of America.
It was sort of an opening of possibilities. Here was a person who was one of us, who made it and who was exquisite, and we were thrilled for her, thrilled for us.
More than 500,000 Jews had served in the American military. Now they were coming home, profoundly changed. More American and more Jewish.
In the Army, it was really the first time that I lived among Christians. You know, until then, my friends, neighbors, etc., were Jews.
Most Jewish young men who went into military service during World War II had never been that far from home. And going off to war, they began to realize that their Jewishness was inside of them. It wasn't just in their family or in their neighborhood or among their friends. And that wherever they went, it went with them. It wasn't just that they had an H for Hebrew on their dog tag.
First time I went through the chow line, they threw a piece of meat on the tray. I looked at it and I said, I think that's pork. Then, moving down the line with my tray out, a guy slapped a big pat of butter on the pork. And that sort of made me queasy, and I shoved the butter off it. And I don't know if I ate the pork then, but I decided, you're going to be a soldier, you'll eat what they give you. It was certainly mainly Christian guys in the company, and a lot of them grew up in anti-Semitic backgrounds. I encountered a guy who said, Steiner, you're Jewish? I said, yes. He said, I thought all Jews were in the quartermaster. How come you're in the infantry? And I got angry. I had a short fuse. He said, Steiny, don't get so mad. You're the first Jew I ever met. It was implied that Jews were not combatants. But after I was wounded, I heard one of the guys in the outfit say, did you see Steiny go after that tank? It was like David against Goliath. And at that point, you know, I had shrapnel in my shoulder, But I sort of relaxed. I felt that the image of the Jew among my fellow combatants was changing.
The military wanted, for purposes of morale, to make sure that there wasn't conflict among its soldiers. When they face a common enemy, they've got to trust each other. And so the military said the United States has this thing called the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's made up of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, and that's part of what makes us different from the rest of the world. So Jews ended up feeling very much more American. They learned to worship together with non-Jews, they lived together with non-Jews, they fought together with non-Jews, and they died together with non-Jews.
I served in France and in Germany. And we ended up in Austria. We liberated a prisoner of war camp. They were almost all Royal Air Force. And we heard a few of them say, we heard rumors that there's a camp for Jews a few kilometers away. So I remember all of us looked at each other, the Gentiles, myself. We weren't sure exactly what they meant, a camp for Jews. But we started to walk and were told to go toward Linz. In Austria, there was still some fighting. And there was the most awful smell one can ever imagine. I can still smell it. It permeated into your brain. It was so powerful. You took a bandana, you couldn't, and it got worse as we walked. We were all looking at each other. What the H is that? And that's when we came upon this compound that turned out to be Gunskirchen, a subcamp of Mauthausen. And that was our first, and we walked into that camp, and of course it's something I can never, ever forget. There were, I hate to use the word, what I thought were creatures, so emaciated that it defied description. 60, 80 pounds, I don't know what. There were piles of bodies. The stench was all over the place. There was urine, vomit, blood. The lieutenant said, anybody here speak Jewish, Yiddish, German, tell these poor souls, that's the term he used, tell these poor souls we're Americans. God, they're free, they're free. And I can never forget the eyes of a couple of them looking at me. They must have been like bones. The arms looked like broomsticks with no flesh. And trying to, like they want to be helped. Help me, hilf me. So I remember, hilf me, hilf me. And I remember saying, Ich bin eine Jude, ich bin eine Jude. And with that, they came to me, Jude, Americana, Jude, Americana, Jude. I almost instinctively pulled away, but thank God I didn't, and they hugged me, Jude, Americana. And then after that, one after one came to me. It's hard for me to comprehend the overwhelming bestiality of what I saw. It was just a violation of everything that was human. What I saw in Gunskirchen is something that put a mark on my soul, and I can't forget it, and I never forget it, and that's why I speak. I don't want them to be forgotten.
In the aftermath of the war, some 250,000 homeless Jews in desperate conditions wandered Europe, as American Jews watched in despair. Although many Jewish Americans remained ambivalent, for most, doubts about the need for a Jewish state in Palestine, their biblical homeland, dissolved. Zionists, once a small, derided minority, now seemed prophetic.
We were aware of the enormity of the Holocaust, and the response to the Holocaust is the state of Israel. It's simple-minded, but it's a powerful fact. I was so absorbed with the idea that we're now struggling to create this Jewish state because of what happened in Europe.
Inhabited by both Arabs and Jews, Palestine had been under the rule of Great Britain for 3 decades. In 1947, Britain announced that it planned to leave, its soldiers and economy exhausted by World War II. Zionists saw the chance to establish a country of their own, while Arabs denounced the proposed Jewish state as an attempt to steal Arab land. War between Arabs and Jews seemed inevitable. Zionist leaders turned to Jewish Americans, now the largest Jewish community in the world, soliciting funds from those Jews who saw the state of Israel as the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream.
My parents had worked for so long to make the state a reality and raised money and scrimped and run benefits and strawberry lunches. We had a household that revolved around making Israel a state.
Fearing that a Jewish state could not survive the impending Arab onslaught, some Jewish Americans joined the Israeli underground army, the Haganah.
There were people who just came out of the woodwork. They had seen what was going on in Europe, and they had a need to just volunteer for this war that's about to begin.
To provide the Zionists with weapons, Jewish Americans had to dodge British soldiers. Britain closely guarded Palestine's border, hoping to prevent the outbreak of war and to win the sympathy of Arab nations who controlled the region's oil.
So all the activity that goes on in America has to be done underground. They're acquiring dynamite, they're acquiring sometimes airplanes. They flew airplanes over from Florida, surplus that they bought. At a certain point, I wanted to go on one of these ships that was leaving America to pick up refugees in Europe and to smuggle them into Palestine. This was illegal, and so the Americans are saying, we can't allow any kind of public undertaking of this sort. The British are saying, you've got to stop this. This is international law. And yet you had people ready to take those risks. American Jews made the difference in having a state or not having a state.
The UN session is being transmitted to Palestine, where huddled over radios or listening to loudspeakers in the streets, the people are avidly following the count.
Afghanistan, no.
The excitement among Jews around the country was overwhelming. Zionism was a popular movement. Even people who had no intention of going there were so ignited by the idea of Jews once again having their pride and having their homeland that it was taken for granted.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom.
I remember so clearly. We had our ears glued to the radio for the vote of the UN.
The resolution of the Committee for Palestine was adopted by 30 people.
And when it happened, people just poured into the streets. And my parents were crying, and it was just totally thrilling.
There was so much excitement when the state was declared. For the first time, we would be able to be, we thought, in charge of our own destiny.
We would always have a place to go. We had a home. This was our country. That would always be our home. And home, Robert Frost says, is when you go there, they have to let you in.
Once Israel was created in '48, the Israelis expected the Jews around the world to rise up and go there. They didn't. Most Jews in America were perfectly happy here. And frankly, Israel depended for its survival during the first few years on donations from American Jews. If the Jews had all gone to Israel, there would have been nobody to keep Israel afloat.
By the 1950s, Jews were just beginning to become part of mainstream America.
We see the vision of America as a land of Protestants, Catholics, Jews. Indeed, Judaism was one of the big three of American religions. This is not just rhetoric. All sorts of obstacles against Jews fall.
Discrimination against Jews was coming to an end. With Jewish organizations applying political and legal pressure, resorts and housing developments began accepting Jews. Quotas at universities and colleges gradually began to vanish. And Jews started entering professions like medicine, law, and banking in what would become record numbers. Nowhere else in the world was there a Jewish population so large, so prosperous, so equipped with the resources to thrive.
We see the vast majority of Jews having emerged from the working class and now comfortably in the middle class. Suddenly, Jews have made it in America.
In 1950, the music industry was stunned when an Israeli song sung by Americans in Hebrew rose to the top of the hit parade. Americans began delighting in the taste of foods that savored of the Lower East Side. Soon, you wouldn't have to be Jewish to nosh on a bagel, or love Levy's rye bread, or enjoy Jewish humor. Everyone was laughing at Jewish jokes, especially if Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks were telling them.
I'd like you to meet now a gentleman who I've had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing 2 or 3 times before, the 2,000-year-old man.
Hello there.
Hi,
How are
sir.
you?
How are you,
Yes,
sir?
good to see you.
You know, many people still do not believe that you are 2,000 years old, but it has been authenticated.
Yes, it has,
You are
certainly.
that.
I have a birth certificate in the land of Og. I don't carry my birth certificate around.
Why?
Because it's a boulder. It's inscribed on
Oh, I see, yes. Well,
Can't carry
would be
that.
cumbersome.
No, credit cards, that's enough.
But at first, the 2,000-year-old man had been a hit only with their friends.
From 1950 to 1960, we never did it any place but at parties because the Jewish accent, remember, the war had been over for 5 years. 1950, it's 5 years ago that Hitler was using everything to denigrate Jews. And we were going to denigrate ourselves by making fun of our own accent. Jews will understand the Jewish accent. So we never did it any place but for friends.
Sir, I read somewhere that you lived in Boston during the American Revolution. Did you know Paul Revere?
An anti-Semite bastard.
Didn't like Paul Revere.
He
He was
hated
a
the
hero.
Jews. He hated the Jews.
No.
No,
He
he
was
liked
a
the
hero.
Jews.
How could you call an
He
anti-Semite?
warned us. He was afraid they were moving in. He had fear that they were going to go in the neighborhood and move in.
No.
They're coming. The Yiddish, they're coming.
No.
All night he was yelling. I heard him
He
yell
was yelling,
myself.
the British are coming.
Oh, my God.
And you moved out.
And one time, George Burns, he says, fellas, is that an album? You got an album of that? And we said, no. He says, better put it on an album. I'm going to steal it. We put it out and it became a hit. And we still weren't sure. We still didn't have that stamp of approval. We worried whether the Goyim in the world would understand. Anyway, Cary Grant used to come by every day and he said, oh, I'd like a couple of those albums. They're wonderful. I gave him one, the first one. Then he used to he'd schnorr a dozen. And one day he said to me, can I get another dozen? I'm going to England. So he came back and he said, I went to the palace. She loved it. I said, who? He says, the Queen. She roared. I said, she loved it? He says, yes, of course. I said, my God, the biggest chicks in the world gave our stamp of approval in. The onus of being, making fun of the Jewish accent was gone.
By the 1950s, Jewish comedians were dominating the new medium of television. Many of them, like Sid Caesar, had once played the Borscht Belt, where they honed their routines on strictly Jewish audiences. Now, they broadened their humor to appeal to everyone. Caesar's Show of Shows became one of the most popular programs in the country.
We weren't doing Borscht Belt material. We weren't playing on Jewishness. We weren't selling Jewishness. You play it for the fun of it. You don't, and you play it for the reality of it. You're playing both parts. You got to remember you got to get laughs, and you got to remember that to make it real. Because then they believe it. When they believe it, they laugh.
Nobody's gonna drop me like a hot potato. Now you, come on out of here. I'm staying here. Go away. Don't you think I have any feelings to take out for a few months, and what do you do? As soon as my back is turned, you go out with that fathead over there.
If you have a story, you got to root for somebody. They want to see how you come out. Do you win the argument? Do you lose the argument? You know.
I wanted to go out with him. I'd go out. Right next to him. I'll sit here. Right next to him. And if I feel like holding his big fat hand, I'll hold it. Just do it, big fat hand. I'll kiss his big fat face. I'd like to see you do that once more. Just once? Yeah. Just that.
Hey, baby! You asked for it!
We knew we're not working for Jews. We're working for an amalgam of races and religions. And so we had to translate something that might have been Jewish and make it universal.
Ja, wanneer? Wat kan uit de kleden wat er uit is? Grijpen me uit de kleden wat er uit is. Blödsinn gehouden. Ja, mein General, ja, ja. Das gefielte Haar in Tier, was heißt, was ein fechter Ständer hier? Ja. Das macht die was oder für das Mannegül ist geschmutzig.
In Yiddish words we use, but we were very responsible. If a Yiddish word would get a laugh from people in the audience and somebody said, what are they laughing at? There would be a joke or a physical action. We were very careful about that, not to just contact our friends and say, here, we're making you laugh, nobody else. Every time there was a Jewish laugh, there was something covering it that people would laugh.
Tunic button, so Tunic machen, Zwei Button, Tunic machen, drei Button, Tunic machen. Du hast gespritzt, eine General.
Yiddish does have a humorous tinge to it because it's got a lot of... If you didn't know it was German or Jewish, spritzt is a funny word.
They know what you're talking about, because you say it. But the andere, ich war da schlicken ab von der ganzen Nacht, von der Nacht.
Hier haben Sie hier, lasst mich will auch nur Parfüm spritzen. Parfüm spritzen. Du hast gespritzt in der Eye.
So it would be that kind of Jewish.
It was Sid Caesar, it was also Carl Reiner. And behind them, this famous group of mostly Jewish writers. All of them fast-talking, all of them nervy, all of them glib.
Mel Brooks, Woody Allen, Neil Simon, Larry Gelbart. They reigned over American comedy for 2 generations. All of them got their start with Caesar.
The best way to get an audience on your side, and most comedians know it, is to make fun of yourself. Basically, if you paint yourself as a schmuck, the audience loves you. So a Jewish joke, it's usually making fun of ourselves. Gee, somebody told me yesterday was one, and it's got to be because Jews were in business. Is what's ethics, and it's also self-deprecating. What are ethics? His ethics are, if you have a partner and you're in the cleaning business, and a coat comes to you, and you reach into the coat, and there's $10 in the pocket. Ethics is, shall I tell my partner? Now, that's a very anti-Semitic joke, but that's a Jewish joke.
They're used to making fun of themselves because they want to distract the soldiers from beating them, you understand? So they would try to make them laugh. And, you know, that's Laughter is the great healer of everything. If you can make another person laugh, the battle is half won.
In the 1950s, when many Americans began heading for the suburbs, Jewish Americans turned their backs on the cities and went too. Nearly a third of all American Jews moved to the suburbs, a rate almost 4 times that of their non-Jewish neighbors. While a majority settled in suburbs on the eastern seaboard, others headed for a new frontier, the Sunbelt cities of Atlanta, Phoenix, Miami, and Los Angeles.
My parents got this letter from my brother saying he was in Santa Monica overlooking the ocean, how exquisite it was, and he would never come back to New York. And so they looked at one another and said, if he's going to be there, we're going to be there.
Thousands of Jews poured into Los Angeles after the war, settling there even more rapidly than other Americans.
Skies were blue, there were orange blossoms around us. It was lovely, but I really didn't like it. It wasn't home, it was very foreign to me, as beautiful as it was.
Jews in LA felt very much like permanent tourists. Home was back east. It's not a dense environment like the Bronx or Brooklyn. It's much more spread out, and Jews mix in much more with other people who aren't Jewish. So the whole intense ethnic quality of public life really dissipates.
Separated from one another by the sprawling suburbs, Jewish Americans found it difficult to hold on to their heritage. Many turned to a movement called Conservative Judaism, a compromise between tradition and change, a middle path between Orthodox Judaism and the more liberal Reform Judaism. It was a way to live a suburban life and remain connected to the Jewish faith. Since in many far-flung suburbs, it seemed impractical to observe the traditional rule, which forbade driving on the Sabbath, conservative rabbis decided that it was better to drive to synagogue than stay home. Conservative synagogues quickly added new members.
Synagogue was a place to socialize with other Jews. It was a comfortable setting to be Jewish, and the religious part of it was, in a way,
Of 1829, when he was 19, he was hired as a trapper on an expedition to the untapped tributaries of the Gila River. He was the greenhorn among some 40 seasoned mountain men, deep in the wilderness on Mexican soil and surrounded by hostile Apaches. They would frequently at night crawl into our camp, Carson remembered. They would steal a trap, kill a mule or horse, and endeavor to do what damage they could. In a world populated almost exclusively by Native Americans, the trappers' best chance at survival was to act as if they were just another tribe.
The mountain men were very practical people. They had a job to do, and they had to go into these dangerous areas and extract a commodity. So they formed all kinds of alliances with American Indians and found that it was practical to live more like an American Indian than like a Frenchman or an Anglo-American.
Carson acquired a good many skills from the Indians, and an attitude as well, a way of thinking of the world around them. I think he adopted a large part of that, and it became inseparable with his personality.
He understood what was expected of him by native peoples that he came in contact with in terms of peaceful relationships and trade relationships, but also in terms of conflict. And he understood that retribution must follow crime and follow it immediately and harshly if one was to survive in this environment.
On one occasion, while trapping on the North Fork of the Missouri River, Carson and his companions came in sight of a large encampment of Blackfeet, a tribe that had attacked them at every opportunity for several seasons past. As Carson recalled it, we were determined to try our strength to discover who had right to the country. Catching the Blackfeet off guard, the trappers charged the village, firing as they went. It was the prettiest fight I ever saw, Carson said later. After 3 hours, we finally routed them and took several scalps. This ended our difficulties with the Blackfeet.
Whatever situation he was in, would he negotiate? Would he fight? Would he bluff? Based on knowledge that he had of the specific tribe, and sometimes a sub-tribe within the tribe. It was not a monolithic situation, the American Indian. He didn't live that way, and nor did many of the mountain men. Their experience was much more informed by practical considerations of how to get along day to day.
In time, Carson became what Americans of his generation might have called a white Indian. He mastered the universal sign language used by the Western tribes and acquired a working knowledge of more than a half-dozen Indian tongues. He dressed in buckskins, slept on buffalo robes, dined on buffalo jerky. And when he was 25, he took an Indian wife, an Arapaho named Singing Grass, offering her father a bride price of 5 blankets, 3 mules, and a gun.
Like many of the trappers, Carson settled down with the American Indian woman. He found that this marriage was certainly a marriage of convenience in the sense that he had someone on the trail with him who helped do all the 1,001 tasks that had to be done. But it was the first love of his life. He was devoted to her.
Not long after they were married, Carson gave Singing Grass a gift of glass beads, an item highly prized among the Arapahoes as decoration for their moccasins. She was a good wife to me, he told a friend years later. I never came in from hunting that she didn't have warm water ready for my cold feet. Carson and Singing Grass would have 2 daughters together. Only one, Adeline, would survive early childhood. And the birth of the second in 1839 would claim Singing Grass's life. By then, the era of the mountain man was coming to an end. Just as decades of over-trapping took their toll and the beaver grew scarce, the fashion shifted to hats of silk. Within a year, the market had collapsed, and Carson suddenly found himself out of work, widowed, and shouldering the burdens of parenthood alone. He was 29. Another man might have headed back to the place he had come from. Carson decided to stay.
You know, he knows that there's this whole life that is going on back east that he left. And he's got a curiosity about it. But I think he knows that's not a world that he can operate in successfully. He knows the West, he loves the West, and this is his world, this is his life. He has become a Westerner.
The West is where races intersect, cultures intersect, sometimes violently, more often not. Kit Carson moves easily in that world. He's not opposed to confronting people straight on and engaging in combat, taking a scalp, if need be, to make a point. But that doesn't mean he couldn't sit down and break bread the very next week.
In May 1842, 2 years after the fur trade went bust, Carson was heading up the Missouri River from St. Louis, having just brought his daughter Adeline to be educated in the East. He was on his way back to Taos, his pockets all but empty and his future uncertain, when he struck up a conversation with a young Army lieutenant who introduced himself as John C. Fremont. Fremont was about to embark on an expedition to survey and map the West, and he had yet to hire a guide. Carson saw an opportunity. After more than 10 years as a trapper, there was no trail he hadn't traveled, no wilderness challenge he couldn't meet. But his pitch to Fremont was characteristically modest. I informed him that I'd been some time in the mountains, Carson later recalled, and I thought I could guide him to any point he would wish to go.
Fremont's suspicious at first. He says, I don't know about this guy, you know. For one thing, Carson was not physically impressive. He doesn't look like a rugged outdoorsman. He was a short little guy.
He was kind of self-effacing and understated, but had this reputation for being quite capable. And Fremont hired him on the spot.
In early June, Carson and Fremont set out from St. Louis with a party of 25 men. Their mission was to map the first leg of an overland route to the Pacific, a route that had been discovered some 30 years before, but virtually unused by anyone but fur trappers and Indians ever since. A route that soon would be called the Oregon Trail. The expedition had been sponsored by the federal government at the urging of Fremont's father-in-law, U.S. Senator Thomas Hart Benton, one of America's most zealous promoters of Western expansion.
Benton saw early on the importance of America being a continental nation, having ports on the Pacific, and having all the land in between. He also understood that before this could happen, the United States needed to understand this land.
Carson likely did not realize it, but he'd signed on to the most ambitious political enterprise of the 19th century. A project that would come to be known as Manifest Destiny.
Carson, he's right on the cutting edge of this movement, this idea that God or nature, or whatever one wants to call it, is going to open up the West for the American Republic, going to make the West the empire of liberty.
With Carson in the lead, and a dozen wagons worth of equipment and scientific instruments in tow, Fremont's party covered some 1,200 miles that summer, moving steadily westward along the Platte and the North Platte, through the present-day states of Kansas and Nebraska, and up into the Rockies as far as South Pass, the broad valley that cut through the mountains and separated the first leg of the trail from the second. The next summer, they returned to complete the route, following the trail west across Mexico's frontier to the Pacific, then turning south and continuing on, over the Sierra Nevada in the dead of winter, down into Alta California, and across the Mojave Desert, before finally winding back around to the southern Rockies. By then, they had surveyed nearly 5,000 miles, and Fremont was convinced he'd found the ideal guide.
He knows the land, and that's what attracts Fremont to him, and vice versa. Fremont is a romantic and lover of nature. Carson had a real sense of duty and loyalty and devotion to John C. Fremont. I don't think he had a sense of duty to American expansionism.
Carson was a very pragmatic, very humble, very steady guy. He had great judgment and a sort of education that was hard-won over many winters as a trapper. He understood all sorts of practical things that Fremont had no idea about.
He could give cool advice when you come across an Indian tribe. You know, how should you act? If you want to try to figure out where water might be, or also how to read signs, how to get from here to there over a mountain pass, Carson's a person you want to ask.
One of the things that Carson did during one of the expeditions with Fremont was they encountered some Hispanic wayfarers who had had their horses stolen from them.
The New Mexicans have been attacked by Indians, and the kind of mindset of the frontiersman was that you didn't allow this kind of behavior to go on, that you had to make a statement.
Rather spontaneously, Carson decides to pursue these Indian horse thieves.
The Indians were a large group, but nevertheless, Carson and his companion snuck up on the band, killed several of them, retrieved all the horses, brought back the horses and several Indian scalps to Fremont's camp.
This really impressed Fremont. Carson risking his life for a complete stranger. And this is really where the myth of Kit Carson as this great sort of white avenger on the trail got its start.
Thanks in large part to Carson, Fremont would come to be known as the Pathfinder, the man responsible for mapping the entire length of the Oregon Trail. A great American explorer on the order of Lewis and Clark. Fremont returned the favor. In August 1844, he had his expedition reports bound into a single volume and published in Washington, D.C. And on nearly every page, he lavished praise upon his trusty scout. Mounted on a fine horse, without a saddle, and scouring bareheaded over the prairies, he wrote in one typical passage, "Kit was one of the finest pictures of a horseman I have ever seen."
Carson became a great romantic figure as an explorer, as a guide, as a frontiersman, as an Indian fighter in these books that were supposed to be reports that were actually grand adventure tales. These books were bestsellers in their day and were used as handbooks by hundreds of thousands of people going west.
Immigrants would be in their wagons holding that, and it would say, this is where you're going to find fresh water. This is where there's going to be grass where you can graze your cattle. It was really the first map of its kind in America.
Native people and mountain men had long known the way across the vast western wilderness. Now, most of America knew it too. In July 1844, Carson rode into Taos, weary from his travels with Fremont and ready to settle down with the girl he'd come to love. The youngest daughter of a prominent New Mexican family, she was petite and raven-haired. A beauty, said one observer, of the haughty, heartbreaking kind. Her name was Josefa, but Carson called her Josefita, or sometimes Little Joe.
She was 18 years Carson's junior. You know, Carson was not exactly winning any beauty contests, but he clearly had some sort of charm and charisma if he was able to win her over.
The wedding had been celebrated 17 months earlier, in February 1843, in the parish church in Taos. Carson had been away from home almost ever since. Now, he and Josefa were finally able to make a life together in their own little adobe house, not far from the town plaza.
He truly married into this whole Hispanic life in Taos. He converted to the Catholic faith in order to please her family. They spoke Spanish in their household. Their kids spoke Spanish as their first language. You know, this was his world.
Taos is a very special place. It's literally the hinge between Mexico and the U.S. It is Mexico's northernmost town. It is a traditional trading place for indigenous peoples throughout the region. The Utes, Comanches, Apaches, Pueblo Indians. So this is a trading hub of the first magnitude.
And In the 2 decades since Carson first arrived, the bustling trade on the Santa Fe Trail had turned the place noisy and crowded. Scores of Americans already had put down roots in town, and more were coming all the time. With his mind on his young bride, Carson may have missed the meaning of all those new arrivals, but they had come to stay. And with the might of the American government behind them, they soon would make the West their own. It all happened more quickly than would later seem possible. When 1845 dawned, the western border of the United States was officially drawn at the Rocky Mountains. Except for Texas, which had declared its independence, and the as yet unclaimed Pacific Northwest, the remainder of the continent was officially Mexican territory. But due to the expansionist designs of President James K. Polk and a bloody war with Mexico that he provoked, by the late winter of 1847, the entire region, more than 500 million acres, was on the verge of becoming the property of the United States.
It was a ball of land grab is essentially what it was during the Mexican War. The American Army marched all the way from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas to New Mexico. It conquered New Mexico. It kept on marching towards California.
Carson happened to be in California that winter on yet another expedition with Fremont, and at Fremont's urging, had lent his assistance to the American forces there. In the field reports that were scribbled out during the course of the fighting, his name appeared again and again, describing how he had guided troops to San Diego, slipped through enemy lines to conduct vital messages, secured aid for several hundred soldiers under siege. As a reward for his valuable service, Carson now had been sent east with a thick packet of sealed letters for the Secretary of State and the War Department, the glowing accounts of his own battlefield heroism among them.
When the United States conquered California, took it away from Mexico, they needed to get the news back. There was no telegraph or anything at that time. They wanted to get news across the entire continent of the United States. And the guy that they decided was the best to do it was Kit Carson.
He arrived in Washington, D.C. in May 1847, some 3 months after he'd set out, having made the last leg of the journey by train. On the platform to meet him was Jessie Benton Fremont, wife of the nation's pathfinder and daughter to its most vocal champion of manifest destiny. She had never laid eyes on Carson before, but she easily recognized him from the descriptions in her husband's expedition reports. It would be her honor, she told Carson, to act as his guide. But Carson found the capital bewildering, a welter of inscrutable signs and gawking strangers. He was outraged at having to pay for transportation and complained about it so bitterly that Jessie was moved to get him a horse. His room at the Benton mansion was stifling, and he soon quit the soft mattress there for a bedroll out on the veranda. But nothing put him at ease.
He was almost like a Tarzan character, been dragged out of the jungle and brought into the city. He didn't really understand city life and had spent very little time in any sort of urban situation. Most of the time he's with Jessie Fremont. She introduced him to all these influential figures in Washington, and people were fascinated by him.
Everyone wants to meet Kit Carson, and that's because Kit Carson is the very living, breathing symbol of the American frontier and of our expansion westward. And, of course, everyone wants to hear from his lips what the opportunities are for America in the West.
Their schemes were ambitious, and to Carson's ears, a bit outlandish. They saw the western landscape transformed, its forests cleared, its valleys covered over with farms and towns. There was even talk of a railroad that would run clear across the continent.
He's sort of amazed at the attitude of these men. He said, they're princes here in the East, but they would be nothing in the West. They would be completely helpless there. But here they put on such airs.
You get a sense that Carson, as much as he hated it, he knew that it was important. These men had sponsored him and were sort of agents of all of these changes that had come to the West. Carson was deferential towards men who were better connected and who were better educated than he was. And he felt a duty to respond to their inquiries in various ways.
By the time he was ushered into the White House for a private audience with President Polk, Carson had only one objective: to get back to Taos and Josefa. Polk had other plans. He had some official dispatches to send to the U.S. commanders in California, and he wanted Carson to carry them.
You know, he wasn't the kind of guy that said, no, he's gonna, you know, he's got a job to do, he's gonna do it.
Carson assumes a new role as a transcontinental courier, bearing these messages back and forth from California to Washington. It's unbelievable when you think about how many tens of thousands of miles this guy covered. In many ways, Kit Carson was the field agent of Manifest Destiny.
Before he finally returned to Taos, 16 months later, Carson's sense of duty would take him across the country 4 times and over some 16,000 miles, most of it on the back of a mule. Along the way, he would convey government reports and military orders and news of developments on the ground, all of it vital information that would bind the two sides of the country together and help to make the West an entirely different place.
Kit Carson went to the West for the freedom and openness to escape from the constraints of society back home, back in the States. But then, of course, he brought it all with him. The dream of a continental nation has been met, and America stretches from sea to sea. The West is transformed, and he sees it all, but he's also one of the major instruments that brings about that change.
By the late 1840s, Kit Carson, the hero of Fremont's best-selling expedition reports, was fast becoming a national obsession. It began, innocently enough, with stories told in taverns and names on a map. Then, in 1849, came a new literary hero, Kit Carson, the Prince of the Gold Hunters. A giant of a man who referred to Indians as redskins, critters, and varmints, and cheerfully slaughtered them by the dozen. Written by an East Coast hack who claimed it had been founded on actual facts, the book was a smash hit. Almost overnight, it became the template for a brand new genre of adventure stories. Hair-raising, action-packed, and set in the uncharted wilds of the far West. Americans called them Blood and Thunders.
These were atrocious books. I mean, they're just terrible to read. I would dare you to read them. But they were enormously popular in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. During the Civil War, they were read by Northerners and Southerners in the trenches. One theme that everyone could agree on: the American West, and great plucky characters like Kit Carson.
Rocky Mountain Kit's Last Scalp Hunt. Kit Carson's Bride. Kit Carson to the Rescue. Some 70 books would be written over the years to come, priced to sell at just 25 cents or less. They would seal Carson's reputation as a hunter, avenger, killer, whose exploits helped clear the way for civilization.
These popular romances are unabashedly about killing Indians. The ones featuring Kit Carson have him riding into a camp, meeting 20 hostile savages, dispatching all of them and scalping them, and riding out with his scalps dangling from his saddle. In the mood of the day, this is heroic.
They had made no attempt to understand the real Kit Carson. They had not gotten his consent to use his name. They certainly didn't pay him any money. And the final irony of the Blood and Thunders was that Carson couldn't read them because he was illiterate.
Of course, the fictional Carson bore almost no resemblance to the real one. As a stranger once put it, after being told that the small man before him was the legendary Kit Carson, "You ain't the kind of Kit Carson I'm looking for."
Kit Carson just was who he was, and other people projected onto him their own beliefs, their own myths. And in that respect, I think he is like the West itself. It's a real place. There were real things that happened, and they were fascinating, dramatic, tragic, but that wasn't quite enough for us as a society. We had to twist it and mythologize it, and sometimes distort it completely out of context. Kit Carson was the greatest living symbol of that desire that Americans had to mythologize the West and take real things and turn them into something else.
Throughout Carson's life, he doesn't linger anywhere, really. He's always on the move. He seems to be constitutionally incapable of saying no to these various missions that are laid at his feet. But the central theme in his life is always that he wants to get back to New Mexico and get back to Josefa and live this sort of normal existence that he imagines for himself.
By the close of 1848, Carson was home in New Mexico, the last of his courier missions finally behind him. In 6 years of marriage, he and Josefa had so far lived together fewer than 6 months. With their first child now on the way, Carson had partnered with a fellow ex-trapper and launched a cattle operation in the Rayado Valley, some 50 miles east of Taos. Like settlers all over New Mexico, they were treading on contested ground.
We tend to see maps of that area of New Mexico, and we see, of course, the American settlements. And we draw lines, and the rest is just Indian territory. We don't know what's in there. In fact, a more realistic map of that area would see very large, very powerful, very stable Indian nations. And even though these nations were nomadic, they had clearly formed territories. And whenever somebody trespassed, they were punished.
Carson had spent too many years among native peoples to be daunted. We had been leading a roving life long enough, he later remembered. And now was the time, if ever, to make a home for ourselves and our children. Then, one afternoon in late October 1849, Army Major William Greer came tearing up to the ranch to ask Carson for help. A few weeks before, a Missouri trader named James White had been heading west on the nearby Santa Fe Trail with his wife Ann and their infant daughter when their party had been attacked by Indians. White had been killed, Ann and the child taken captive. In the days since, the captured woman and her baby had been spotted in a Jicarilla Apache encampment, out on the plains, somewhere east of the trail. Greer figured if anyone could find them, it was Carson.
Kit Carson understood the Jicarilla Apaches quite well, spoke their language, and he was a likely candidate for this job. So he begins to pursue them east towards Texas. He was accompanied by a group of soldiers. They chased the Jicarilla Apache for something like 12 days.
It was the most difficult trail I ever followed, Carson later said. In nearly every camp, we would find some of Mrs. White's clothing, which was the cause of renewed energy on our part to continue the pursuit. Finally, late on the 12th day, Carson saw plumes of smoke curling skyward in the distance. The cooking fires of a large Jicarilla Apache camp.
There's a disagreement about how to approach the Jicarillas. Some within the party hope that they can negotiate with them. Carson believes they should attack immediately. In the confusion, however, the Jicarilla Apaches spot the party and scatter.
Greer ordered the men to charge, Carson remembered. But the order was too late for the desired effect. In about 200 yards, the body of Mrs. White was found. Perfectly warm. Had not been killed more than 5 minutes. Shot through the heart with an arrow. Later, sorting through what remained of the camp, one of Greer's men came across a book, which presumably had belonged to Mrs. White. A copy of the wildly popular Blood and Thunder, Kit Carson, the Prince of the Gold Hunters.
Of course, Carson couldn't read it. He had to have someone else read it to him. But it was extraordinary because in this book, Kit Carson was assigned the task of rescuing a woman who had been kidnapped by Indians. And here he was, given the task of saving this woman. But in this case, in the real situation, he'd failed and she had died. And he felt perhaps that this book had given Ann White some sort of false hope that she would be rescued, that Kit Carson was near.
The myth of the West came head-to-head with the reality of the West in that moment. And Kit Carson was just stunned by that experience. He never got over the incident, and it haunted him all the rest of his days.
Things might have been different if James and Ann White had been the last or the only. But they were two among tens of thousands, a tiny drop in the massive migratory wave that was then rolling westward and swamping everything in its path. Carson could trace the start of it back to the discovery of gold in California, news of which he is thought to have carried on one of his courier missions east. In 1849 alone, some 100,000 Americans had set out for California. And as the traffic on the trails increased, so too did the clashes between settlers and Indians. Inevitably, Carson was called upon to help mediate those conflicts. And in 1853, he accepted a position as an Indian agent for the northern New Mexico Territory.
I'm sure part of his calculation was that he would moderate whatever destructive impulses the U.S. may have had towards these groups. So part of his calculation, I'm sure, is that, well, I better do it rather than somebody else.
For an annual salary of $1,550, he would now serve as the U.S. government's official representative in its dealings with the Moach Utes, a band of nomadic hunters that New Mexican officials had branded the most difficult to manage in the territory. Day after day, Carson listened to the Utes' grievances, lodged complaints on their behalf, smoked and talked with them. He grew especially fond of a chief named Canich, who would prove a lifelong friend.
The Utes called Carson Father Kit, and they loved him by all accounts. He was fair-minded and honest and began to really do the very tough work of thinking about Indian policy. What are we doing to the lives of these tribes?
He was a better Indian agent than most of the other people at the time because he actually knew the Indians. A lot of times they were political appointees, people with connections. Sometimes they were missionaries come not necessarily just to understand the Indians, but to make them not Indians, to convert them. And Carson was not entirely unique, but he stands out as somebody who honestly tried to do what he thought was the best for them.
By far, the bulk of Carson's time was taken up with New Mexico's most persistent source of conflict, an ancient practice common to the Utes, the Navajos, and other native peoples, known as raiding.
This was part of their way of gaining resources. You would go out and raid. Because some of these settlements were exposed, and because they had tangible resources that you could appropriate, there were women and children that could further your population expansion. All of these things came into play. These were very shrewd communities living in a very harsh environment. And so you had to do what you had to do.
Carson considered raiding a grave threat to frontier security, and he knew from long experience that the Indians' own code of justice demanded retribution. But as the months and years passed, he began to see that many of the crimes blamed on Indians were in fact the fault of whites, newcomers who were settling on traditional hunting grounds and driving off all the game. When a Ute chief called Blanco was accused of robbing sheep, Carson reported that the Indian had had no other choice. If the government will not do something to save the Utes from starving, he argued, they will be obliged to steal.
Here we have a world that had existed on its own for thousands of years. A world that is coming to an end because of a very rapidly growing American population. Carson came to see the moment white settlers outnumber indigenous people, then it's very hard for these indigenous peoples to actually hold the line.
He was alarmed. Everywhere he turned, he saw that the Indian populations were dwindling. He began to grapple in his own way, dictating hundreds and hundreds of letters. You begin to see a realization that many of the changes that he had set in motion were really changing the whole complexion of the West.
No American, least of all Carson, believed that the nation's westward migration could be stopped. The government has but one alternative, he concluded, either to subsist and clothe the Indians or exterminate them.
There are these incredible forces at work at this time. There is a nation intent on moving across the West as quickly and as decisively as possible. Kit Carson found himself incapable of stopping those larger forces. So he became an agent in the destruction of their way of life, though he was not an Indian hater in the sense that a lot of Anglos of the mid-19th century were true racist Indian haters in the worst possible sense. That was not Kit Carson.
His children are Indian and Hispanic. And he knows that they will carry that appellation in their life because of the blood that they carry. He deals easily with native peoples because he's just like them. That doesn't mean he's on their side. He's not. But it means he understands where they're coming from.
On the day the Army courier turned up with his orders to round up the Indians in the fall of 1862, Carson had just marked his one-year anniversary as commander of the 1st New Mexico Volunteers. He'd accepted the position during the early months of the Civil War, when a force of Texas cavalry rode into southern New Mexico and proclaimed the area Confederate territory. The Confederates had been easily turned back, and Carson hoped soon to be mustered out, returned to Josefa, and reinstated as an Indian agent. But events had conspired against him. While the New Mexican forces had been preoccupied with the Civil War, the Indians, especially the Mescalero Apaches and the Navajos, had stepped up their raiding. Over the previous year alone, more than 30,000 sheep had been stolen, and some 300 people killed. Now, Carson had received an urgent dispatch from Brigadier General James Henry Carleton, ordering him to put the Indian troublemakers down, one tribe at a time, and once and for all.
James Henry Carleton was a piece of work. He was a New England Calvinist, a man of a very tidy intellect. These were messy social problems, and he could not countenance this sort of situation, and believed with a great conviction that he could fix it almost overnight.
Convinced that treaties had no lasting effect, Carleton planned the most comprehensive and most ruthless campaign ever to have been carried out in the West. Carson and his men would make total war on the Indians. They would kill all the adult men on sight, take the women and children prisoner, and march them several hundred miles to the new reservation Carleton had established in the grasslands of eastern New Mexico, the Bosque Redondo.
He wanted to force them overnight at gunpoint to become Christian farmers. He believed this was important not only for their own good, but he believed this was a model for how to deal with all the nomadic tribes of the West.
He felt that he could solve this problem in New Mexico, this Indian problem. And Carleton turns to Carson, of course, because he's Kit Carson.
Carson was 52 now, and bone-tired. And there was an odd pain in his chest that came and went without warning. He missed his wife and regretted that the 4 children they'd had together lately had seen so little of their father. But an order was an order, and Carson could not refuse. As he struggled to reconcile himself to another season away from his family, he called in his clerk and dictated a letter in Spanish to Josefa. Adora esposa, he began. Do not worry about me, because with God's help we shall see each other again. I charge you above all not to get weary of caring for my children, and to give each one a little kiss in my name. I remain begging God that I return in good health to be with you until death. Your husband, who loves you and wishes to see you more than to write to you. Four months later, Carson could report to Carleton that the first phase of the campaign had been accomplished. Although he'd quietly ignored the order to shoot the men on sight, he'd nevertheless managed to round up the Mescalero Apaches. And he asked that Carleton release him from his commission.
He had not joined the U.S. Army to fight Indians. He joined to fight the Texans during the Civil War. And he said, if the Texans return, I'll put on a uniform again. But I need to go back to my wife and children. Josefa was pregnant again. He wanted to get back home to Taos.
Carleton refused. He needed Carson to complete the campaign. No one else, he insisted, possessed Carson's peculiar skill and high courage. And no one else stood a chance against Carleton's next target, the most formidable of all of New Mexico's native peoples, the Navajos.
좀 희귀하게 한테게 난 히다치들 또다다게 야다하다다다게 근데 좀 저때 고다하듯이 거에 저때기니 있다잖아 세오부터 반듯이
For nearly 500 years, they had lived on the ground bordered by the 4 sacred mountains. For 500 years, they had tended their flocks of sheep and cultivated their fields and orchards. And for 500 years, they had tangled continually with their neighbors, perpetuating the cycle of raid and retaliation that had made the New Mexico territory infamous. They called themselves the Diné, but to the many who feared them, they were the Navajos.
New Mexico was terrified of Navajo. They were warlike. This was a part of their culture, raiding, stealing, killing. They were formidable. They were dangerous, and people were afraid of them.
Carson lived in New Mexico his entire adult life, and public enemy number one was the Navajo. Everybody in New Mexico, every Hispanic person, had some friend or family member who had been killed by the Navajo or had been stolen by the Navajo. And I think he thought Carleton's idea of a reservation on the Pecos was as good as any that had been put forward as to how to end this cycle of violence.
In early July 1863, Carson set off in the direction of Navajo country with a column of several hundred men, U.S. Army officers, New Mexican volunteers, and auxiliary troops recruited at Carson's request from among his former charges, the Utes, who were long-time and bitter tribal enemies of the Navajos.
Kit Carson followed orders. That was part of how he had gotten to where he had gotten. Not questioning the society he was in, and he got there by taking orders and doing a good job of carrying them out. When Carleton told him, go take care of the Navajo for me, he was going to go do it.
The colonel is after the Indians at full speed, one of Carson's men noted, and is determined to overtake them if horseflesh will stand it. In a typical scout, Carson pushed his men nearly 500 miles in 27 days, capturing over 1,000 head of livestock, but pitifully few Navajos.
He goes out into Navajo country and he doesn't see a soul. You know, he basically thinks this is a kind of like a ghost campaign against a ghost tribe. He's fighting an enemy he can't see.
Frustrated and eager to bring the campaign to a rapid conclusion, Carson made a fateful decision, one that would define him for generations to come.
He could not get the Navajos to come out in the open battle. And so the thing to do is to destroy their source of strength, you know, which is food and their homes. And that's what he did. His tactics causes great suffering.
He ordered every cornfield to be destroyed, every melon patch, every bean patch. He had his men guard the salt sources and the water sources, and chopped down every tree. It was brutal. This was not majestic, heroic warfare, if there is such a thing. This was a dirty little war of attrition with the express intent of starving the Navajos out.
He knew the Indians. He had known them from an early time as a mountain man. He probably knew Indians better than any other white man of his time. He knew what they would stand and how they could be brought to terms with the army. And, you know, he didn't hesitate, I think, to act on the basis of his knowledge.
Carson later estimated that his men had destroyed nearly 2 million pounds of food. Come winter, he told Carleton, the loss will cause actual starvation and oblige the Navajos to accept emigration to the Bosque Redondo. For the moment, however, the Navajos remained maddeningly elusive. "I deplore it the more," he complained to Carleton, "as I now have only one way of communicating with them, through the barrels of my rifles." Summer gave way to fall, and the campaign ground on with little result. Finally, in November, on the eve of his 54th birthday, Carson requested a leave of absence to attend to what he called some private business of importance. Carleton would not hear of it. Carson would be permitted to leave the field only after he had captured 100 Navajos, and then only on the condition that he first conduct a thorough sweep of Canyon de Chelly, a 100-mile sandstone labyrinth in the heart of Navajo country.
I think Carson was a little spooked by Canyon de Chelly. All his instincts as a mountain man had taught him to stay away from tight spots and situations where you're vulnerable, you're on the defensive. He really had no interest in personally going down in the canyon. He skirted around the sides of it. He scouted from the rim. But he was more than happy to have his subordinate officers go in and get the glory of having penetrated this great bastion of the Navajo people.
He knows that this is a powerful place and that he can violate the rules of the game there and suffer for it. We think of him as being the person who led the siege in Canyon de Chelly. He did it at a distance.
By now, the Navajos had begun to feel the effects of Carson's scorched earth campaign. Hidden in various caves and atop a towering butte known as Fortress Rock, they daily grew hungrier, colder, and more desperate.
They were trying to save themselves from being killed, and so they had to run and hide. They ran off into the caves and were hiding. They had hiding places along the rim of the canyon. He wanted to take our lives. He wanted to end the life of the Diné people.
Two days after the first of his men entered the canyon, Carson encountered a party of Navajos riding under a flag of truce.
And this is where Carson's at his best. He's able to communicate with them, reassure them that this campaign is not a war of extermination.
He selected 10 influential men, gave them a horse and 10 days' ration, and told them to go home and tell them they would be treated well. That if they surrendered, they will not be harmed. And that works.
There was no other way, because they said, we're dying off. We have to listen to this man, and that we have to follow his rules if you wanted to live.
By 10 o'clock the next morning, January 15th, 60 Navajos had surrendered to Carson. Soon, that number would swell to more than 800, and Carleton's quota would be met. The end was finally in sight, and Carson determined to hasten it along. Now is the time, he declared, to prosecute the campaign with vigor. He then issued a new directive to one of his captains, ordering him to march his company the length of the canyon and lay waste to the Navajo orchards.
There were 1,000 peach trees, orchards in the canyon, and the Navajos had taken great pride in those trees, and they loved the fruit that was born. Carson ordered them burned. Needn't have been done. There was no real point in that. It was so gratuitous, but it was in a way the last blow, you know.
By invading Canyon de Chelly, by laying waste to it, and by making it impossible for the Navajos to remain there, Carson breaks them. He breaks their spirit.
The whole canyon was silent. It was dead. No harmony in it anymore.
If Carson felt any remorse, his final report gave no sign of it. We have shown the Indians that in no place are they safe from the pursuit of troops of this command. That the principle is not to destroy them, but to save them, if they are disposed to be saved.
He absolutely guarantees them that he will protect them. He will make sure that their families are taken care of. This is the power of Carson. They trust his word. They believe him. He is, after all, Kit Carson.
In Santa Fe, Carson received a conqueror's welcome. Jubilant New Mexicans accosted him in the streets, slapping him on the back and shaking his hand in congratulation. Even Carleton gushed with praise and declared Carson's victory the crowning act in a long life spent fighting the savages. The Carson of fiction, the ruthless Indian fighter who had animated dozens of blood and thunders, no longer seemed quite such a caricature.
For hundreds of years, the Navajo had been a threat to the New Mexico settlements. He's broken them in just a matter of months. And he's lionized, again, as the great American hero.
The adulation meant nothing to Carson. The pain in his chest was constant now, and his exhaustion so complete that one of his men had described him as reeling in his saddle. As soon as it was possible, he made his excuses to Carleton and pointed his horse toward home. Meanwhile, thousands of Navajos set off on the grueling trek to the Bosque Redondo. A journey of between 375 and 500 miles, depending on the route. Most of them with nothing but the ragged clothes on their backs. What rations the army provided made many of them sick, and in any case, there was nowhere near enough food to sustain them all. Of the nearly 9,000 who made the journey, the U.S. government estimated that 350 died en route. Most from starvation, illness, or exposure. And some 2,000 others simply went missing. The Navajos would count the missing as dead and put the number of casualties at more than 3,000. The episode would come to be known as the Long Walk. Those Navajos who survived would remember it as a death march. And they would hold one man responsible.
He did a lot of damage to the Navajo Nation. Every Navajo today, has family history of someone that went on the Long Walk. My grandfather, was 6 years old when he went, and the stories that my grandmother and my mother used to tell were of great hardship and pain, and I hated Carson for that.
He abandons the Navajos on the Long Walk. He deserts them. Perhaps he knows what's coming and he wants to be protected from the blame. Perhaps he's just getting old and tired. But whatever the reason, Kit Carson breaks his word.
Over the years that followed the defeat of the Navajos, Years that would prove to be Carson's last. The West he'd chosen as a young man increasingly came to resemble the world he'd left behind. Americans pushed their way in, built their towns and railroads. In one way or another, they pushed the Indians aside. Somewhat unexpectedly, the voice that was raised time and again on their behalf was Carson's. He'd spent one summer as superintendent of the Bosque Redondo. And as he put it to a Senate investigating committee in 1865, one summer was enough to convince him that the entire experiment had been a terrible mistake.
He told the commission that these forced relocations don't work. To remove a whole tribe from their ancestral lands was to doom the experiment from the start. And that if these reservations were going to work at all, they had to be located on the land of the people in question. So Carson emerges in this testimony as really one of the most eloquent and most perceptive thinkers with regard to Indian policy in the West.
Now, in the twilight of his life, Carson became a sort of elder statesman of Indian affairs. He helped to negotiate a treaty with the Plains tribes and advised both the military and the government on Indian policy reforms. And in 1868, despite chest pain so severe that he could barely breathe, he again made the long journey to the nation's capital, where he assisted in talks that established a permanent reservation for the Utes on the very ground the tribe claimed as their own.
I think he felt an obligation to the Utes, friendship to the Utes, loyalty, all those things that were part and parcel of his makeup. And so he needed to go to Washington because he was the person who would be the one who could really represent them.
Here he is, this Indian fighter, known for his various campaigns. And yet, he was also a peacemaker and a diplomat. I think the trick to understanding Carson is to go back to that idea that for him there was no such thing as the American Indian. He sided with certain groups, and other groups were his enemy throughout his life.
Before Carson left Washington, he paid a call on his old friend and employer, John C. Fremont. Distressed at the sight of his former scout, whom he later described as greatly altered by suffering, Fremont recommended a specialist and begged Carson to consult him. The diagnosis was bleak, an aneurysm of the aorta. It could rupture, the doctor said, at any moment. "My wife must see me," Carson told Jesse Fremont. "If I was to write about this or died out here, it would kill her. I must get home, and I think I can do it." 2 days after his return, his 8th child, a daughter, was born. 2 weeks after that, Josefa, suffering from complications related to the birth, died in his arms.
Here he thought he was going to try to get home just in time to die, and instead, she dies first. He's just completely stricken with grief and pines away, and is really kind of a catatonic after her death.
Carson's health deteriorated rapidly. Soon he was moved to a nearby military post, where his doctor kept him as comfortable as possible and spent long hours reading aloud from a book entitled Nestor of the Rockies, the first full-fledged biography of Carson ever to have been published.
How that must have been, with death closing in, to hear those words and to relive all those glorious days from the past.
He wanted to be back in that old world, sleeping on a buffalo robe, having a buffalo steak, a little coffee, smoking his pipe. You know, it's not a bad way to go. In one sense, it's a mythic way of ending, and another way it's very much like the real Kit Carson, the less assuming part of him, which is he wanted to be the way he had been once.
As Carson lay on his deathbed during the waning days of May 1868, the U.S. government was in the midst of negotiating an historic treaty with the Navajos, one that would acknowledge the hardship of their forced relocation and return them to their land among the four sacred mountains. But Kit Carson would not live to see their homecoming. On the afternoon of May 23rd, 8 days before the Navajo Treaty was signed, he called out suddenly from his pallet of buffalo robes on the floor, "Doctor, compadre, adios." There was a rush of blood from his mouth, and then he was gone.
Kit Carson never really questioned what might have been going on in the West. He accepted those things, that was just the way the world was. He brought into it no sentimentality, no myth of what was going on. He was living in that moment, and it was just pretty straightforward for him.
He was a complicated man, turning upon himself in certain ways. This confliction between compassion on the one hand and very violent behavior on the other. How to reconcile those? Maybe we need to remember that in him those things were never reconciled.
Maybe one of Kit's quotes would fit best here. He said, something to the effect that I don't know if I did right or if I did wrong, but I did the best that I could.
He dies at just the right time. Kit Carson had no place in the New West. Not the west of railroads. Not the west of the slaughter of the buffalo herds. Not the west of the Indians' last stand. The New West was not a place he would have been happy in, but he's the man who created it. He was that agent of empire that made everything possible that was to follow.
Stay tuned for scenes from the next American Experience. But first...
Next time on Masterpiece.
Good God, what is the matter?
My younger sister has eloped. Jane, do you not see that more things have been ruined by this Benedict's reputation? Mr. Darcy or any other respectable man will want nothing to do with any of us. But Lizzie, you never sought his love. Why should you care? I don't know.
Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Part of the complete Jane Austen on Masterpiece. Sunday, 9/8 Central on most PBS stations.
There's more about Kit Carson at American Experience Online. See a map of American frontiers, access a teacher's guide, and watch the program online. All this and more at pbs.org. American Experience's Kit Carson is available on DVD. To order, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Next time on American Experience.
He made the American West into the American story.
Buffalo Bill Cody.
He blurred the line between truth and entertainment, history and myth, to become the hero in the adventure Americans wanted to live. But his real life would be a rough ride.
He's not William F. Cody. He's Buffalo Bill. And he's got to play that role 24/7.
Buffalo Bill, next time on American Experience. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. Major corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual.
Throughout history, ordinary people have considered it their responsibility to do something extraordinary. Liberty Mutual, proud sponsor of American Experience.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
We are PBS.
This is the most expensive waterfront property in the entire world.
The Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is the most powerful weapon ever designed, and there's nothing like it.
The whole ship exists so that I can go off the end and go fly.
My job is to make sure the ship is ready and the crew is ready. And it is a fine ship, but the heart and the soul is not the steel, it's the crew.
It's one of the Navy's greatest ships and the most demanding.
You got to have the passion, you got to have the heart, and you got to have the mindset. But above all, you got to have the energy.
But some of their biggest challenges come from each other.
You have some of the best of the best and the worst of the worst. You meet them all. And some of them become your best friends, and some of them become your worst enemies.
Keep your eyes open, keep your mouth shut.
It ain't what I thought it would be.
Do they have what it takes to survive the next 6 months at sea?
Always drama, always something.
Oh, man, overboard.
Anyone see Stuart?
Okay, I'm wasting my time. I've had it.
Basically what it is, a big floating high school.
The majority of the young people that join the Navy, they join for discipline. And I'm going to make sure that you get a heavy dosage every day.
Probably the closest thing that a person who is not in prison will ever get to be in prison.
You're not going to get away with a whole lot in the Navy. You get caught in possession of alcohol?
Yes, Mrs.
You're going to be looking at water for a very, very long time.
Nothing fuels the ship like the crew of Carrier.
We're trying to control chaos.
One thing happens to that bomb and it goes off. Missiles will start shooting off and it'll just be a chain reaction.
Definitely one of the most stressful experiences I've ever had.
That's where it gets dangerous. You really got to keep your head up. Our flood runs about 1,000 miles an hour. Go get him. All right, here we go.
Come aboard Carrier. Only on PBS.
Next time on Frontline,
They went into houses and killed women and children.
was it a war crime or self-defense?
The platoon commander told them to clear the houses. Clear means to eliminate the threat. How can a child in pajamas be considered a threat?
The inside story of what happened at Haditha.
We know the Iraqi people aren't the enemy, but our enemy hides among them.
Rules of engagement. Watch Frontline.
How do you build America's trust? You start with fairness, honesty, integrity. You offer thoughtful, in-depth reports, objective, intelligent analysis, real answers to tough questions, and award-winning coverage that sets the highest standards. You dig deeper, push harder, and get the stories that no one else is telling. Year after year, only one network has earned and kept America's trust. PBS.
Who's your favorite couple out there, ladies and gentlemen?
If you can't stand the heat, get off the dance floor. International Latin sizzles across the screen. The spicy Latin couples take the floor. The temperature's rising. Only one will blaze to the top. Catch the action this week on America's Ballroom Challenge.
will see why tornadoes form.
My first reaction when I saw this mummy was, oh my God, it's a pharaoh.
It is the key to curing disease.
Well, that's history right there.
Local broadcast of American Experience on Vermont Public Television is funded in part by Otter Creek, offering custom-crafted and professionally installed awnings, sunrooms, and closet systems to distinguishing homeowners throughout Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York for over 30 years. By Windows and Doors by Brownell, a local destination for Marvin Windows and Doors, showrooms in Williston, Vermont, and Plattsburgh, New York. Discover the difference. By Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont, offering a structured, challenging academic setting for traditional and military students. Expect challenge, achieve distinction. This program is also supported by contributing members like you. Viewers supported statewide, Vermont Public Television.
If you'd like a night of music, dancing, laughs, and romance on the French Riviera, don't miss Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, the smash hit musical comedy straight from Broadway and live on stage. The New York Post calls it one of the funniest musicals in years, and syndicated columnist Liz Smith says it's one of the most enjoyable nights I've ever spent in the theater. Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, live on stage. Missing it would be a crime.
Don't miss the Broadway National Tour coming to Burlington's Flynn Center on February 25th. For tickets, call 802-86-FLYNN or go to flynncenter.org.
Company's coming to great performances, so get ready to party with Bobby and all his friends in the Stephen Sondheim George Firth landmark musical comedy take on marriage
Marry me
and commitment.
Some people still get married, you know.
Married.
You could drive a person crazy.
Look for the Tony Award-winning revival of Company on great performances.
Coming to you Wednesday at 9 on VPT. Join Vermont Public Television live Thursday evening at 8 for the latest installment of Report from Washington. In this edition, host Susan Allen sits down with Congressman Peter Welch to discuss the top issues in Washington and how they'll affect us here in Vermont. As always, the phone lines will be open and the viewing audience will be driving the discussion. Join Vermont Public Television live Thursday evening at 8 for the latest installment of Report from Washington. Local broadcast of Carrier on Vermont Public Television is funded in part by Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont, offering a structured, challenging academic setting for traditional and military students. Expect challenge, achieve distinction. By the Sensors and Integrated Systems Division of Goodrich Corporation in Vergennes, a significant contributor to education in Vermont for more than 50 years. This program is also supported by contributing members like you.
Tune in April 27th, the premiere of Carrier, a 10-hour landmark series on PBS.
The whole ship exists so that I can go off the end and go fly.
This is the most expensive waterfront property in the entire world.
It just becomes like a small town. It just happens to be floating on the water, has to be, 1,092 feet long and headed towards Persian Gulf.
Basically what it is, a big floating high school.
One stuffed animal. Only one. I'm gonna allow one out, and that's it.
It's tough being out of here.
Anything and everything can happen up there. you know, and if you make it, then you make it. If you die, then hey, that's just the way it is.
You have some of the best and the worst of the worst. You meet them all. And some of them become your best friends, and some of them become the worst enemies.
It'll be long, and it'll be hot, and it'll be hard. There will most assuredly be stories to tell.
Corporate funding for Carrier was provided by CSC. Major funding was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, we know where we're going, but we don't know where we've been, and we know.
Who are the kids that serve? Do they know what they're doing? Do they know where they're going? Do they know what the mission is? Are they afraid? Are they courageous? Are they defiant? Who are they?
And the future is certain. Give us time to work it out.
This is a hard job on many different levels. And the rewards are, you know, sometimes these transparent things to a lot of people.
It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done, I think.
We have to be able to protect ourselves and our brother and sister countries. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the Navy. That's the whole purpose of the military, is to provide protection for our freedoms. If we're not around and something happens, what are we good for? What are we here for?
I guess I basically did this to put it on my resume, you know, and now that it's on my resume, I'm ready to move on.
I was looking to make a series that was character-driven but in a high-stakes environment. My co-creator, Mitchell Block, had a specific sense that a Carrier would be in a fabulous environment. In order to make this show work, we had to have a level of access that was very unusual and extremely robust in the view of the Navy. They had shows on carriers, they obviously have news events or press events on carriers, but the idea that a film team of 17 people was going to embed on board the Nimitz for a full deployment was an enormous leap of faith for the Navy. You know, there were a lot of discussions. This is a warship in combat, in service, and filmmakers can feel pretty renegade.
What are you doing, Jim, man? You cleaning up what? Or walking around with a cup of coffee? Which one are you doing?
Investigating the berthing, Master Chief, make sure everything's going well.
Investigating an open container there, shipmate.
Yes, Master Chief.
Ultimately, there was a foundation of respect that got built, and as a result, we ended up going through that experience with them. We waded through the same water. We were there on the same 140 degrees on the flight deck days.
It's hot plus. It is so hot. I saw the devil the other day with a hot weather t-shirt and a bottle of Gatorade.
And we were really able to get to know people.
The film has a remarkable intimacy because we lived the deployment with them and we shared all the ups and downs with them, and after a while we became part of the crew.
When they realized that we were going to be there the whole time, people really started to open up.
As I like to say it, we are trying to control chaos. It's just high tempo up here, man. Our blood runs about 1,000 miles an hour. You ready?
I wanted to have 10 distinct episodes that moved chronologically. You knew that you were going to depart in the beginning of the show and you were going to return from a full deployment at the end of the show. But at the same time, we wanted every episode to have its own character arc and its own moments.
You know, I just want things to work out. I don't want to go home and just like not even know who I am, you know. My worst fear is that there's another guy involved. But, I mean, I doubt that's going on if they're being pregnant at all, but I don't know. I'm Airman Christopher Altus. I'm 21 years old. You know how I am, though, dude. I worry about everything.
To me, Chris Altus is a dreamer. He's funny and he's irreverent, and he's having his own journey as well as being on the ship, because it turns out his new girlfriend is pregnant and they're having a baby, and he finds that out just a few weeks before leaving.
I have no idea what's going to happen when the kid's born. I mean, this is my kid, you know. This baby's going to look up to me for everything. And, you know, I'm not even married to Tanya, and I live in an apartment, and Speed is my roommate. I don't know what to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, I'm going to see what it takes. Of course, I'm not going to choose going to get drunk and play drums with the guys over having to watch the baby or take care of the baby, and they'll understand. Between playing the drums and taking care of the baby, yeah.
He's a kid. He's really a kid. And he's hanging on to this dream and this idea that when he gets back, there's going to be a baby, he and Tanya are going to be together. He doesn't have to sleep on his old futon anymore. And we go through that with him.
I care for her a whole lot, and I want to be with her. I don't know if I could say I love her yet, though.
For Chris, he's really growing up on this journey.
He don't stay out anymore. No more coming in past 4.
Well, there's so many great people in the series, and they are living in a very interesting environment.
Hey, you too, MC. All righty. What's on the agenda for tomorrow? We got any new plans? Anything like that? No, just wake up and do the same thing. Every time the alarm goes off, I say, I woke up.
This meat still might have a pulse.
Living on a ship is a completely unique experience.
This is where I sleep at. And, you know, these racks are very convenient for the military.
You're talking about living in a metal bunk.
After a while, I get used to this. Most people aren't this good first time around.
A level of volume, noise. Living conditions that are unusual.
Here we are in the trash room of the ship.